It's July 20th, 2026. Welcome to yes2hellwith.com. Perhaps one of the greatest obstacles to restoring freedom in America has nothing to do with government itself. It has to do with us. More specifically, it has to do with our inability to have a disciplined conversation. Most people believe they're having a discussion. They're not. They're waiting for an opportunity to say what they already believe. They aren't listening to understand. They're listening for an opening to introduce their own theory, their own philosophy or conclusion. That isn't a conversation. That's two monologues taking turns. A real conversation has a very different purpose. Its purpose is to isolate the issue requiring resolution. Once that issue has been identified, every question, every comment, every piece of evidence should move the discussion towards resolving that issue. If it doesn't, it belongs in another conversation. That sounds simple, but it's astonishing how rarely it happens. I experienced a perfect example just the other day on Facebook. I posted a hypothetical situation. A father and his son were peacefully fishing in a river. A game warden approached them and issued citations. I then asked one question: what should a constitutional sheriff do? That was the conversation. Nothing more, nothing less. And then one gentleman responded with a lengthy explanation about maritime law. He explained admiralty jurisdiction and commerce. He explained navigable waters. He explained why, in his opinion, every lake, river, stream, pond, every body of water in America falls under maritime law. Whether his conclusions were right or wrong is completely beside the point. He never answered the question. He answered a different question. He offered a different proposition. The moment he changed the subject, the conversation ended. It was no longer a conversation, it became his monologue. That happens every day. Someone raises a constitutional question and someone else introduces the UCC or corporations, or someone else talks about straw man, or someone else the 14th Amendment. Then there's admiralty law. Every person sincerely believes they're contributing, but they aren't building upon the conversation. They're replacing it. And once the original issue is replaced, the possibility of solving it disappears. That is one of the greatest weaknesses I see throughout the freedom movement. People are constantly introducing new conversations before the original one has reached a conclusion. As a result, very little is ever resolved. Now let me be clear. I'm not suggesting those other subjects have no value. Some of them deserve careful examination, but they deserve their own conversation, not this one. If we're discussing the constitutional responsibility of a sheriff, then let's discuss the constitutional responsibility of a sheriff. If we're discussing the limits of government authority, let's stay there. If we're discussing natural rights, let's do the same until we've reached a conclusion. Only then do we move to the next issue. That is how serious people solve serious problems. Not by changing the subjects, not by having their ego inject what they deem to be significant, but by remaining disciplined enough to stay with the issue until a practical remedy has been identified. That's exactly why I continue returning to the office of the county sheriff. Not because every issue involves the sheriff, but because if we're serious about restoring constitutional government, then we should isolate the constitutional office at the local level, who possesses both the authority and the responsibility to prevent government from exceeding its constitutional limits. Once we isolate that issue, the conversation becomes remarkably focused. How should a constitutional sheriff fulfill the oath he has already taken? How should he protect the rights and freedoms of peaceful citizens? How should he respond when government exceeds its constitutional authority? Those questions lead somewhere. Those questions can produce practical answers. If we have sheriffs who understand the Constitution, who understand the limits placed upon government, who possess the wisdom to distinguish peaceful liberty from unlawful conduct, and who possesses the courage to act, then we've identified the beginning of a practical remedy. Everything else becomes secondary, not because it lacks importance, but because it no longer distracts us from the objective. The objective is not to win an argument. It isn't to impress people with how much we know. It isn't to accumulate another theory. The objective is to identify a problem, remain focused, pursue it, and then find a solution. Imagine what more would happen if Americans learned that kind of discipline. Our conversations would become shorter, clearer, more productive. We would spend less time talking past one another and more time solving the problems that actually confront us. Perhaps that's one of the greatest lessons we can learn. Not simply how to speak, but how to remain focused on the question before us until we've earned the right to move on. Because the restoration of freedom won't come from 1,000 disconnected conversations. It will come from disciplined people having disciplined conversations that remain focused on one issue. And that is until a practical remedy is found. And then we can tackle another problem. And as always, may truth reign supreme.